I want to mention something I'm sure you all know, which is the famous distinction made by C. Wright Mills in his book, The Sociological Imagination. That's the distinction between private troubles and public issues. And I think he was speaking, I'm not sure I remember this correctly, but I think he was speaking about studies that were made of people who were out of work, who had no work, during the Great Depression of the 1930s in the United States, and how they blamed themselves. They felt it's my fault because I don't have a job. And he said, of course it was not their fault. It was the fault of the economy, which did not provide any jobs. There were no jobs for them to have. So it wasn't reasonable to think that it was my fault that I didn't have work. But you had to understand that the reason people were out of work was that the economy had failed. And Mills made of that a very general proposition, which of course is a wonderful sociological tactic, to take a specific case and say, what if this is true everywhere and for everything? In this case, the problems of being a graduate student. I have to write papers. I have to write a Thèse. It's interesting to ask yourself, first of all, to recognize that this is not something that was given thousands of years ago, that everybody of a certain type has to write a Thèse. That this is not a biblical, not an injunction from the Bible. Right? You don't have to do that. You have to do it because. And the reason is that you are involved in a grand social organization, an enormous social organization, which is the world of higher education. So in order to become part of that world, eventually it's necessary to do what the world requires. It appears in your life as a terrible problem, right? I have to do this thing. I've never written a Thèse. I don't know how to write a Thèse. I don't know anybody who will tell me how to write a Thèse. So it's a great mystery. Well, all of those things are the result of certain features of social organization. Just to remind you of what you know, there is a big gulf between the teachers and the students. The teachers are also writing the equivalent of a Thèse, something similar. They're writing a book. They're writing an article. Students do not see that. They don't see the teacher at work having the same problems. How can I write this? Where am I going to find something to say? How will I organize it? All the things that I described in this book, Becker, leçon, sociale, that the students I worked with were worried about. How can I make sense out of what all these things I know? I know hundreds of things, discrete facts. I have ideas, but I don't know how to put it together, and I'm afraid I will never know. And I'm afraid also that when I show my work to people, they will laugh. They will not say, oh, how marvelous. No, they will laugh. They will laugh at me. So I described here in the first seminar that I taught about how to write, one of the people there who was not a student, was a professor somewhere. And she described how, I asked them all to tell me, how do you write? All the details. What kind of paper do you write on? What kind of a plume do you use? What kind of a machine do you use? And everyone had a story that was a little bit crazy. And she said, well, I can only write on paper which is yellow, which has lines, and I can only write with a pen that writes with green ink. I mean, what is that? And then, and she said, also, I always write on the second sheet, not on the top sheet. So I said, why do you, I mean, I could not understand this. So I said, why do you do that? She said, if someone comes by and they looked at my paper, they would see what I wrote, and they might laugh. So I have the first paper, I pull it down, nobody sees what I wrote. Okay. Immediately I knew this was wonderful for me, not for her. But it was wonderful for me because now I understood, and I made a kind of theoretical analysis very quickly. I said, this is something like the anthropologist Malinowski described in his great book about magic in the Trobriand Islands. When do people make magic? Well, if they know in a rational way how to accomplish something, for instance, how to find their way in the ocean, they do it the rational way. But if they have no idea what to do, then they do magic. It's better than nothing. And that's what she was doing. She was doing magic, a green pen. Okay, so, but it was all private. This was the first time she had told anyone this. The other people in the room did not laugh because they knew me and they knew that I would insist that everyone tell their story. And they all knew that they had an equally crazy story to tell. So, and everyone did tell their story. I told my story. I can't remember now what my magic was at that time. But now I have other magic that I do. But it's still magic. But it was private. And so the great thing that my class accomplished is not that I explained how to do it, because I could not, but that they learned that everybody, that their worst fear was true. They were crazy. And it wasn't so bad because everyone else was crazy. And the craziness did not come from inside. The craziness came from the world they lived in, which was the world of the university, where the teachers did not show them anything but the last version that was as perfect as they could make it. So that was one thing. And the other, that it's all secret. People don't tell each other about these problems, so everyone thinks it's my problem instead of our problem. And the second thing is, I have to write a thèse. Why? Well, if I want to be a professional in this field, I have to have a degree. This is the way you get a degree. 3 or 4 or 5 people will decide whether my work is good enough. This is very frightening, because this is not the world of the profession. This is the world of school. In the real work of sociology or any other field, you write your article, you publish it somewhere, and it's addressed to the whole world. Everyone now can read your article. That's very different from having 4 people or 5 people who are the people who will judge and decide. Now you have the whole world to find allies, readers, people who agree, people who will argue with you. You can become part of the conversation of that professional world. Okay, but when you're a doctorant, you don't have that privilege. It's these people that you have to satisfy. And as we all know, sometimes they're very arbitrary. Sometimes you can't understand what they want. Sometimes what they want might be something that would be good for them, but maybe not so good for you, etc. I mean, all the possible things you can think of occasionally happen. In fact, most often they don't happen, because the teachers most of the time are very reasonable, nice people, and they're not trying to kill you, they're trying to help you. It might not seem like that, but they are trying to help. But in other words, the work you have to do must satisfy a very small audience. At the extreme, it's more extreme in before you get into the higher levels of university education, when you write papers for a class. And a great teacher of what in the United States is called English composition, that means writing. A great teacher of that subject described the paper you write for a class as a paper no one wants to write and no one wants to read. Well, that's a different kind of paper. Now you're writing something that you're afraid someone will read. And it's much harder. It's much more difficult. So the problems then arise from the social organization of higher education. Right? I have to do this, and I have to satisfy those people, and I have to do this under the condition that I have no idea how it's done, and I have no way to find out. That's really a terrible problem, and I don't blame anyone for being upset about this, for being bothered by that. So that's what I wrote this book for. I wrote that book to try and make the whole process and the whole problem less mysterious, to show people how it was part of the world of the discipline they were becoming a member of. And if you understand it that way, then it's like Mills telling the person who has no work, it's not your fault. That's not the problem. The problem is this is the way this world is organized. Now, you are a little bit in the position of the man without work, because he can't change the economy, and it's not very likely that you, even if you all join together to do something, and of course everyone here has the memory of 1968. I know this. Even if you didn't exist then, you know what they did. But in fact, really nothing changed that much in the French university system as a result of that. And people are still writing. You no longer write the Thèse d'État, which was something really you could hardly lift. But now you write a smaller one, but still it's a serious thing, and it's just like it was. So that's the problem, and the problem for each of us is to know what to do, how to deal with that. Well, the answer to a question like that, there's not one answer. The answers depend on where you are, who you work with, what the conditions are that you have to meet, you can do some things. I mean, the things that Sebastian and Maurice have done, which is to open the discussion to everybody, to make sure that everyone can come and join and share their experiences and learn, at least in part, the lesson that Mills taught. You know, that it's not your fault.